October 26th, Fort Garde. The sky over Nantes hung heavy and gray, as if the heavens themselves could not bear to watch what was about to unfold. By mid-morning, the fields outside the city were a sea of faces. Nobles in silks, peasants in rags, merchants clutching their ledgers, mothers holding their children a little too tightly. The air was sharp with the smell of wet earth and wood smoke. Somewhere, a church bell tolled. They had come for fire. They had come for the man who once stood shoulder to shoulder with Joan of Arc, who rode into battle draped in France's colors, who was cheered as a savior when the English were driven from Orleans. A war hero, a marshal of France, a name sung in the halls of kings. Now they came to watch that name turn to ash. He emerged on a wooden cart, stripped of the silks and armor that once announced his glory. The man who had feasted in marble halls now wore a simple tunic, rope-bound, flanked by priests murmuring prayers for a soul that many believed already damned beyond redemption. His dark hair, once combed and perfumed, hung loose and matted. His eyes, still sharp, still dangerous, swept over the crowd. Some swore they saw tears. Others swore they saw a smile. They called him Gilles de Rais. But in hushed tones, in the whispers traded in taverns and at market stalls, he had another name, the Butcher of Children. This was not the execution of a common criminal. This was an exorcism, an attempt to purge, in fire and smoke, a darkness so profound it had rotted the heart of a nation. The crowd wanted to see the rope tighten. They wanted to smell the burning. They wanted proof that evil, no matter how gilded, could be dragged into the light and destroyed. But as the flames were readied, a question hung in the cold autumn air. How does a man go from hero to monster? How does a savior of France become its most cursed name? The answer begins decades earlier, in the glow of victory, and in the shadow it cast. Part 1. Glory on the Battlefield. He was born in 1404, swaddled in silk and destiny. The de Rais name carried weight across Brittany and Anjou, vast estates, ancient titles, and a fortune large enough to buy kings. From the moment he could stand, Gilles was groomed for greatness. Tutors drilled him in Latin and the art of war. Priests whispered of divine favor. His sword arm grew strong before his voice had lost its youth. In those years, France was bleeding. The 100 Years' War had reduced whole provinces to blackened ruins. The English banner flew over French castles, and the crown wavered under the weight of defeat. Then, like a spark in dry tinder, a peasant girl from Domremy rose, claiming visions, carrying God's command to drive the invaders out. Her name was Jeanne d'Arc. Gilles de Rais met her at a time when hope was a stranger to France, and hope, for once, wore armor. At Orleans in 1429, the air was thick with arrows and the stink of boiling pitch. Men screamed from the ramparts, their armor splitting under English steel. Into this chaos rode Gilles, tall, broad-shouldered, a blue and gold surcoat streaming behind him. Beside him, Jeanne's banner cut the sky, white against the smoke. They fought not as strangers, but as twin blades of the same strike, her voice rallying the soldiers, his sword carving a path through the enemy. By dusk, the siege was broken. It was a victory so sudden, so complete, it felt touched by the divine. The city bells rang until their towers trembled. The people cheered not just for the Maid of Orleans, but for the dark-haired knight at her side, the baron whose courage had helped turn the tide of a nation's war. The rewards came swiftly. King Charles VII himself draped honors upon Gilles, lands, titles, and the highest of all, Marshal of France. His banner flew beside the crowns in every campaign that followed. In the royal court, he was the embodiment of chivalry, a warrior of unshakable valor, a nobleman of exquisite taste. But in the quiet corners of the great halls, some had begun to notice that even in victory, his eyes lingered not on the glory of God or king, but on the gleam of gold, the shimmer of jewels, the opulence of pageantry. The seeds were there, small, invisible to most, waiting for the right soil, the right season, to grow into something far darker than anyone could imagine. Part 2. The descent begins. In May of 1431, the smoke rose over Rouen. Jeanne d'Arc, his comrade, his talisman, stood bound to the stake. Her white dress turned gray with ash before the fire even touched her. Gilles was not there to see it, but the news hit him like a lance through the chest. The Maid of Orléans was gone, and with her, the last clean thing in his world. The war stumbled on, but victory no longer tasted of glory. The campaigns grew fewer. The court's eyes turned elsewhere. For a man like Gilles, fed on the wine of applause and the intoxication of purpose, peace was a slow suffocation. He retreated to his estates, sprawling fortresses of stone and shadow, Château de Machecoul, Tiffauges, Ingrandes. Here, far from the gaze of the king and the army, he poured his fortune into spectacles that blurred the line between theater and worship. He built chapels gilded like cathedrals, paid choirs of 100 voices to sing only for him, staged pageants so extravagant they devoured gold like fire devours wood. But excess was not enough, not anymore. In the dim-lit chambers of his castles, new voices began to whisper. Alchemists spoke of secrets that could turn lead to gold. Magicians spoke of powers that could bend the will of heaven and hell. Among them was a stranger from Italy, Francesco Prelati, a man who claimed he could summon demons and bind them to human command. Gilles listened and believed. They told him that for the pact to work, the offering must be pure, uncorrupted, blood untainted by sin, the blood of children. Some say he hesitated at first, some say he did not. The villages near his lands soon learned the danger of a stranger's smile. Servants in fine livery would arrive in market squares, promising work for bright boys and pretty girls, kitchen work, pages, singers for the baron's private chapel. For families bent under the weight of hunger, it seemed a blessing. No one saw those children again. Behind the black gates, in candlelit rooms heavy with incense and the metallic scent of blood, the Marshal of France began his true work, not as a soldier of the crown, but as a butcher in service of his own hunger. The descent had begun, and no one in Brittany yet understood how far and how deep it would go. Part 3. The machinery of horror. Evil, when left unchecked, does not descend in chaos, it organizes. And in the shadowed halls of Gilles de Rais' castles, evil was an industry. At the center stood the marshal himself, his word law, his desires, the only compass. Around him, a loyal core of men who owed him not just their wealth, but their very survival. Henriette, the soft-spoken valet whose hands could lift a child as gently as a nurse before binding them to a chair. Poitou, quick with a joke, quicker still with a blade. And above them all, the Italian, Prelati, the high priest of this dark religion, feeding Gilles the poisonous gospel that each scream, each drop of blood brought him closer to the gold and glory he craved. Their work was systematic. Servants in fine clothes prowled the markets and fairs, their eyes scanning for the smallest signs. A boy too thin for his age, a girl whose shoes were worn through at the soles. They spoke with honeyed tongues, offering food, shelter, honest work in the household of a nobleman. They carried letters sealed with Gilles' crest, proof enough to silence any doubt. Once the children crossed the threshold of the castle gates, they vanished into a world no parent could imagine. The corridors smelled of damp stone and candle wax, doors closed with the sound of finality. In the deepest chambers, the air was heavy with a copper tang that never quite faded. What happened next was part ritual, part indulgence. Witnesses at his later trial spoke of the same patterns repeated over and over, Gilles greeting the children warmly, offering them fine clothes, a meal, even music. Then, as night fell, the kindness curdled. The clothes were stripped away. The laughter turned to commands. The games became pain. Some were strangled slowly, so that their terror would stretch like a drawn bowstring before snapping. Others met the sword or knife, the killing blow coming only after Gilles had taken from them what he desired. A few were dismembered while still alive, their cries echoing off the cold stone, muffled only when he had heard enough. When it was over, the bodies vanished into the furnace. The flames fed until nothing remained but ash. No graves, no markers, no trace. In the villages, whispers began to coil like smoke. Children were disappearing. Some said wolves, others spoke of bandits. A few dared to voice the unthinkable, that the great Lord himself was the predator. But in 15th century France, the word of a peasant against a marshal of the realm was less than nothing. So the gates stayed open, the carts kept coming, and the machinery of horror ground on, fueled by gold, fear, and the silence of a world too frightened to see the truth. Part 4. The first crack in the wall. For years, Gilles de Rais moved like a shadow through the law, untouchable, insulated by his title, his fortune, and the fear he inspired. Whispers died before reaching the ears of the court. Priests turned their faces away. The peasants prayed not for justice, but simply that their own children would be spared. But in 1440, the first crack appeared. It began, ironically, not with missing children, but with property. Gilles' extravagance had drained his fortune to a dangerous low. Land, his birthright, was being sold off piece by piece to cover debts. In a bitter dispute over one such estate, Gilles took a step too far. He kidnapped a clergyman, Jean Le Ferron, and held him prisoner within the walls of Machecoul. It was an act of arrogance even the 15th century could not forgive. To strike at the church was to strike at the one power that could rival a noble's own. And this time, there would be no looking away. The Bishop of Nantes seized the chance. Officially, the investigation was about the abduction. Unofficially, it was the moment long suppressed rumors began to crawl into daylight. The bishop's men moved quietly at first, speaking to servants, questioning villagers, following the faint scent of truth through the labyrinth of fear that surrounded Gilles' name. What they found was worse than anything they had expected. Parents emerged from the shadows with stories of vanished sons and daughters. Former servants, their voices shaking, spoke of nights filled with screams, of chambers locked and guarded, of fires in the furnaces that burned long into the dawn, And then came the most damning of all. Members of Gilles' own inner circle, willing to trade testimony for their lives. Piece by piece, the image of the gallant marshal crumbled. In its place rose a figure so monstrous that even the hardened officials of the medieval church could not disguise their horror. The investigation had begun with the theft of land. It would end with the unmasking of one of the most prolific killers Europe had ever known. Part 5. The Trial and the Confession. September 1440. The great hall of Nantes was packed. Rows of clerics in black robes, nobles in stiff brocade, townsfolk pressing at the edges to glimpse the spectacle. At the center, chained but still carrying the posture of a man born to command, stood Gilles de Rais. He began as he always had, in control. He refused to recognize the court's authority, claiming that as a marshal of France, he could only be judged by the king. His voice was measured, his gaze defiant, as if centuries of privilege could still shield him. But privilege cannot outstare truth. One by one, the witnesses stepped forward. A mother, her voice breaking, told of the day her son left for work at the baron's castle and never returned. A former servant described a locked chamber, the sound of a child sobbing, the sharp scent of blood. Then came Henriette and Poitou, his closest confidants, now stripped of loyalty, trading damning detail for their own survival. Their words painted the same picture, the warmth of Gilles' welcome turning to cruelty, the rituals in candlelight, the strangling, the blades, the way he lingered over the moment between life and death, the burning of bodies until all that remained was ash, ash scattered so no trace could ever be found. The weight of it pressed down on the hall like a storm. Even those who had come expecting horror found themselves unable to meet the eyes of the accused. Under the threat of torture, Gilles' composure cracked. The defiance bled out of his voice. And then, before the assembled court and God, he confessed, not in fragments, but in full. He spoke of killing more than I can number, estimating over 140 children, though he admitted he had stopped counting. He described their innocence, their beauty, as if recalling treasures he had once owned. His words wavered between remorse and something far darker, an almost fond recollection, as though part of him still savored the memory. The court sat in silence. Here was the truth. The hero of Orléans, the Marshal of France, was also its butcher. On October 25th, the sentence was pronounced: death by hanging, followed by burning to ash. Not just to kill him, but to erase him, to ensure no relic of his body could become an object of veneration or horror. The next morning, the city would gather to watch the man who had once ridden beside Joan of Arc vanish into flame. Part 6. The Execution. October 26th, 1440. The dawn over Nantes was cold and colorless, the kind of morning where breath fogs in the air and sound seems to carry farther. By mid-morning, the fields outside the city had transformed into a living tide, nobles wrapped in fur, peasants in threadbare cloaks, merchants clutching ledgers they would not open today. Mothers kept their children close as if the mere sight of the condemned could snatch them away. At the center stood the scaffold, a high gallows, and beneath it, a pyre built with careful, deliberate malice, seasoned wood stacked with straw to catch quickly, to burn hot. The message was clear. This was not merely an execution. This was purification by fire. A cart creaked through the crowd. Gilles de Rais sat within it, hands bound, flanked by priests murmuring the litany for the dying. Gone were the silks, the gold, the armor. He wore a simple tunic, the coarse fabric of the condemned. His face was pale but composed, the kind of calm that unsettled the onlookers. When the cart stopped, he rose and turned to the crowd. Witnesses would later say his voice carried without strain. He begged God's forgiveness. He asked pardon from the families whose children would never come home. And then, in a final turn of irony, he warned the nobles present against the very sins, pride, excess, the worship of wealth, that had hollowed him from the inside. It might have been repentance. It might have been theater. The executioner placed the noose. A judge gave the signal. The trapdoor fell. For several long minutes, the Marshal of France kicked against the air, his body jerking like a marionette with cut strings. Then he was still. But death was not enough. His corpse was lowered onto the pyre. The torches touched the straw, and fire bloomed upward with a roar. The flames clung to him greedily, curling around flesh and bone until the shape of a man was lost to the blaze. The crowd watched in silence, faces lit by the infernal glow, some crossing themselves, some simply staring. The burning lasted hours. By the time the fire died, nothing remained but ash. These too were scattered, cast into the wind, so no relic, no fragment of the monster could remain. The smoke thinned. The crowd dispersed. And in the empty field, the earth itself seemed to exhale as if relieved to be rid of him. The hero was gone. The monster was gone. But the shadow he cast would remain for centuries. Part 7. The Aftermath and Legacy. In the days that followed, Nantes returned to its routines. Merchants reopened their stalls. Bells called the faithful to Mass. Children's laughter returned to the streets. But beneath the surface, the city carried a wound no fire could cauterize. The execution of Gilles de Rais was spoken of in hushed tones, as if saying his name too loudly might summon his ghost. Parents told their children the story as a warning: beware of strangers, even those who wear the smile of nobility. Priests folded it into sermons about the wages of sin. And among the nobility, his downfall became a cautionary tale whispered over wine cups. Proof that not even the highest rank could shield a man once his evil became too visible. His castles stood silent, their stones heavy with memory. Some swore they could still hear faint cries in the night, carried on the wind from Machecoul and Tiffauges. Travelers avoided those roads after dark. For generations, the land seemed to hold its breath. The church preserved the trial records in Latin, a grim ledger of testimony, confession, and judgment. Historians, centuries later, would pore over these pages, recognizing in Gilles' crimes the early shape of what we now call a serial killer. The selection of vulnerable prey, the escalation of violence, the blending of sadistic pleasure with ritual. His was not madness in a moment. It was a system, deliberate and sustained. And so, his legacy split in two. In the annals of war, he remained the marshal who rode beside Joan of Arc, whose sword had helped reclaim France from the English. In the darker register of history, he became Le Barbe Bleue, Bluebeard, the embodiment of aristocratic depravity, a figure who proved that the gravest monsters can hide behind the brightest banners. The lesson endures. Power without conscience is a fire that consumes everything, including the one who wields it. And the most dangerous evil is not the beast in the shadows, it is the hero on the battlefield who, when the drums go silent, finds no song left but the one the darkness sings. Centuries have passed, the flames that devoured him long gone to cold ash, but the warning remains, sharp as the day he died. Even the hands that lift a nation can one day close around its throat.